Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
To the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast, I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. And Bob is off on assignment, but we'll be back soon. But today we are going to be talking about a topic that actually Bob and I have worked on a lot, which is around anti-war organizing. And then also today's conversation will be about how anti-war organizing intersects with environmental and climate organizing. And so joining us today is Teddy Ogborn, who is an organizer with CODEPINK. Teddy is CODEPINK's War is Not Green coordinator. Teddy's based in New York City. Has several years of experience in documentary storytelling, strategic organizing, direct action. You know how we love direct action on the Green and Red podcast, particularly with climate actions in New York and New Jersey. And we're going to talk today a bit about the intersection of militarism and climate change. So Teddy, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Thank you so much, Scott, for having me. It's great to be here.
Yep. And just a little background, the rise of militarism and the climate crisis are intertwined. The US military is the world's largest consumer and causes more greenhouse gas emissions than 140 nations combined. And then there's a whole bunch of, stats and numbers around how much money the Pentagon spends every year and the contracts it does with private weapon companies, which we've covered extensively on the show. But maybe we could start off a little bit with, could you just go into how war and the climate crisis are intertwined? Just give us a little bit deeper background on just more than just what I said. So
no, for sure. Yeah, and thank you. And listen, they could not be more intertwined. And the fact that we even need to be having this conversation at this stage in the climate crisis, we'll call it that, is insane to me. We cannot stop the climate crisis if we do not work towards demilitarization. And yet I still get questions from people within my local climate organizing and across the country who say, oh, well, what does war have to do with the climate? And it has everything to do with the climate. I mean, just like you said, the US military is the planet's single biggest consumer of oil. And it doesn't stretch the imagination to then realize it is the largest emitter institutionally of greenhouse gases on the planet. And so, yes, we need to be talking about demilitarization, especially of the US military when we're talking about climate change and addressing the climate crisis that we're in. It's also an environmental justice issue. And when I talk about environmental justice versus climate change, what I'm talking about is ways to address equitability for largely people of color, disadvantaged people across the world that are suffering as a result of the exploitative systems that the dominant hegemony has created for them on environmental grounds. And so what you're looking at there is also severe environmental injustices caused by the US military, such as the US military occupies 30% of the nation island of Guam, and use its main aquifer as a shooting range. PFAS, forever chemicals, leak from nearly every single of the US military's 800 military bases worldwide, largely into communities that can't do anything about it because the Pentagon is essentially, it has riddled the EPA with loopholes through which they fly constantly. And so when we're talking about the fact that indigenous people on this planet are its greatest defender of natural resources, of the forests, of the climate itself, and the fact that our military continues to colonize them, continues to kill them and poison them, yes, the climate crisis and the environmental crisis are deeply intertwined with US militarism.
And how much, what are the numbers on how much greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, the Defense Department, the Pentagon, what have you?
Yeah, so that is itself a hairy question because they are able to hide those numbers quite well. They don't report them. They actually don't have to. Since the 1995 Kyoto Protocol, so this was the equivalent at the time of the United Nations Conference on Climate Change in Kyoto, the United States worked very, very hard to exclude military emissions from the counting of emissions globally. And of course, many other imperial nations celebrated that decision. They don't want to count their emissions. They don't want to limit their military capacity as they see it by having to stay under certain carbon limits. And so those numbers have been obfuscated very, very intentionally. But you have this really fantastic academic researcher named Dr. Nita Crawford from Brown. And she's done a lot of landmark work on this. And using data from the Department of Energy, she's calculated roughly that the US military has emitted 1.2 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere since the 2001 War on Terror, or I should say the beginning of that War on Terror. That figure is staggering. It is causing apocalyptic levels of global warming. Like you said, it is greater than the emissions of most nations. And again, we're working with researchers. This isn't self-reporting. We're working with researchers using all the information that they have at their disposal. One of the first steps actually that we talk about when we talk about decarbonizing the military, which is the same thing as demilitarization, in my opinion, is we need to start making them count these emissions. This is something that comes up every year at the annual conference of the parties on climate, the COP. That we absolutely need to start counting military emissions. And of course, the countries that oftentimes kind of hold court at COP, such as the US, unfortunately, continue to batter away those concerns and those demands because it is, of course, not in their imperial interest.
Yeah, and I just want to also point out for like our listeners is that we've had different, since 2001 we've had 4 different presidents, different administrations. We had Bush, who was a climate denier, but we had Obama, and we've had Biden, who are supposedly climate champions, and we've not seen any sort of shift from the amount of emissions coming from the Department of Defense. Whether we've had a Democrat or Republican in office, is that right?
That's absolutely true. And I think the key word there is supposed climate believers, right? I mean,
yeah. I always say it, with a, tongue in cheek when I talk about them being good in any way. So
of course, right. But it's it just continues to drive home the irony, the terrible, horrifying, perilous irony of all of their statements on climate change. I mean, that's part of why Joe Biden got into office and trying to secure Gen Z votes, because young people in particular are very concerned about their future, as they should be, right? I'm here in Brooklyn. I'm on the island of Long Island. I go to Manhattan often. That's also an island. And this is where these major financial institutions, which we'll get to in a sec, I'm sure, that are funding these military contractors reside. And they're on sinking islands that are going to continue to pay the price for the climate crisis. I mean, any president over the past, since the general public has begun to take climate change seriously, that says that they understand the severity of the crisis, has proven themselves to be lying. They don't understand it. Otherwise, they would act on it.
Before we get into a couple of questions I have around contractors and financial institutions, I have one other big question around around the government and the Pentagon. Is what has organizing looked like on trying to get the Pentagon to address their carbon footprint?
So you have all kinds of coalitions that are taking different approaches. For example, you have the F-35 coalition, which one of our national directors, Danica Katovich, does an excellent job of helping to organize. This is an international coalition, I think, of over 230 plus orgs that are saying we do not need the F-35 jet developed by Lockheed Martin for a slew of reasons. It's costing taxpayers trillions and trillions of dollars. It's nuclear capable, which of course is, on the climate side, the ultimate environmental tragedy is nuclear holocaust. But the emissions on these things are insane and absolutely, I think it's like, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's like hundreds of thousands of gallons or hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon per week in use or something like that. I mean, it's far more than its predecessor, but it's meant to be more technically capable. And then you also, of course, have people trying to leverage that international pressure. So, for example, this last November around Armistice Day, which coincided with the Conference of the Parties, I joined with Veterans for Peace, which has a really robust climate campaign, because they're really on it with this issue. They know that not only does the increased militarism around the world not lead to more safety, but leads to more war. It's not a thinker, but it's causing greater and greater amounts of suffering and mass death, to put it plainly and factually, on account of its carbon emissions. And so this is a part of a growing effort at the Conference of the Parties internationally to put that pressure. And one of those big steps that's been taken is at every COP you have you have events and votes that are on the actual agenda. These are decisions that are resolutions that each country will take back and attempt to commit to, although they're not as binding as we would like. And then you have side events. Unfortunately, counting military missions isn't yet on the agenda at COP, but that's what we're pushing for every time. We've had some great success this last year. There were side events on the agenda at COP, which it sounds small, but the conversation is happening. It's growing. Activists are being incredibly vocal. It's undeniable at this point what's happening. And so, the U.S. military, people across the globe knows what the U.S. military is doing to them in terms of colonization, increased militarization, and now especially in terms of the climate crisis.
Yeah, it's interesting. The other thing that kind of like that I think about is, like, I work in environmental world. I work in environmental NGO world. I don't feel like I actually hear the big green groups talking about this that much. And we had Medea on the show back in December, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And she was actually talking. We had her on to talk about war in Ukraine, and she actually said that there were some initiatives that CODEPINK was pushing to try and get like environmental groups to do a sign-on letter against the war in Ukraine. But I'm kind of curious about, are you addressing this with some of the bigger green groups, like the big ones like Sierra Club or League of Conservation Voters or Environmental Defense, and what has the response been, if you have?
Yeah, no, I thanks for bringing that up too. So that has been a long-running campaign through my time at CODEPINK, as working to get these big greens to sign on to this letter. The letter essentially calls for increased negotiations, a sincere attempt at pushing negotiations from the U.S. In Ukraine on environmental grounds. I mean, we've talked already about military emissions, of course, but you have decades of unarable farmland as a result of this war. You have some estimates as like 50,000 dolphins in the Black Sea have washed up on shore, and of course,
a nuclear plant which is being used as a shield.
Yeah, right, exactly. And these are costs that apparently some people are willing to accept, risks that some people are willing to take. And so the letter was written to make it abundantly clear that this is not something that we can afford, and this is one of many reasons that this concerns the entire planet. The actual process of asking groups to sign on to the letter was, I think, a microcosm of the very reason that my position exists, is that we do need to push for this, even the basic understanding around military emissions and environmental injustice caused by the military, to pervade the environmental movement, to pervade the climate movement. Because, I think oftentimes I would run into the obstacle of the letter being considered too geopolitical, too political in itself, for groups to sign on to. But when you're writing a letter for peace on environmental grounds, it feels pretty straightforward. I mean, it's not drawing party lines. You're saying we want the deaths to stop, both because of the war itself, as quickly as possible, if possible, and then we want these catastrophic emissions to end as a result of the war. And so, in some ways, I understand groups that have, whether their tactic is more on the legislative side, whether they have connections to politicians. I mean, the issue in some ways is largely rooted in the politicization of the war itself, which has been an absolute, mind F to even understand, how we got to where we did. But yeah, so it has been a real slog to get those letter sign-ons for that. And I think what we're learning with the campaign is that there's some really basic education that needs to be done to build some momentum, build a sense of urgency around this issue. Because like I said, you can't solve climate change. I mean, you can't address climate change meaningfully, I should say, if you're not addressing militarism.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It just there's like a politic around the war in Ukraine, which we've actually brought up on this show quite a bit. We actually had a whole series on it once the war started last year, where we
Mm.
identified a group of people who in the past have been called NATO intellectuals or NATO hawks. We call them actually NATO liberals. And it's the sort of like pro-war wing of the Democratic Party, which is like a big chunk of it. And it seems like that some of the bigger green groups, which are like very tied in with the Democratic Party, don't want to come out and criticize the war because they don't want to, offend their political benefactors. And it's just like an interesting dynamic, and it's like a campaign in itself to sort of go after. I would also suspect that like a lot of people in those organizations are ones who have like Ukraine flags in their on bumper stickers and things along those lines as well. Like they want to do something about the climate crisis, yet they are like at least tacitly supporting an effort which is contributing to it significantly.
Right, right. And you know what? I do have empathy and sympathy for people that are of that mind, that I think that there are so many reasons, whether they're personal, familial, or because you live in the United States of America with the media that we have, for that folks might be reluctant, I think, to deviate at all from that mainstream approach to the war in Ukraine. I think that the fact of the matter is, and my focus and what was really interesting to me with the letter itself was, it doesn't propose itself any solutions. It's saying to push for negotiations, which is an option at this juncture, right?
Yeah.
It's not saying anything about, the, geopolitics, Crimea, territorial concessions, things like that. These are things that, I myself within this work, specifically for on this climate camp, it's not my focus. My focus is military missions. And so I think it was interesting for myself to run up against some of those contradictions and to think a little bit thoroughly about like how best to approach that. And I think you're right in many ways, about the allegiances of the Democratic Party, and thus oftentimes the orgs that earn their vote or provide their vote.
Yep. Endorse them, do or not for them, all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Just to shift it a little bit, there's a pretty huge budget at the Pentagon around private contractors, right? And so we like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, companies like that. And the other trend that we see in corporate America is everyone at least has like a purpose statement of some sort around the climate crisis, right? They have social justice purpose statements. They have them around the climate crisis because there's been an effective climate movement targeting corporations for the last couple of decades on that. And I'm wondering if you could just like, is your work overlapping with the sort of greenwash that's happening, within the private contractor sector connected to the Pentagon it's actually literally the military industrial complex.
Of course, yeah. I mean, the goal of the campaign in many ways is to call it out at every turn, because the greenwashing is, covering these companies in bullshit. That's what their strategy is, to avoid any kind of regulation, to avoid any kind of accountability. And so, I mean, like, I remember even before I was a climate activist, I was watching this video of Obama unveil like a new bomber, and he was saying this thing's going to be powered by corn, by ethanol.
Yeah,
and
it's exactly what I'm talking. It's what I'm talking about. There's a lot of memes that talk about this stuff.
Yeah, right. And this was before I really, felt like I did have any kind of political consciousness. But I was like, this is actually crazy. How are people falling for this? Like, there's no way that we're not going to bomb people more cleanly out of our way out of the climate crisis. And that's essentially the claim that they're making. All of these companies, they're tech companies, right? They can't pretend to not understand the science behind the climate crisis, which is abundantly clear now to even people without degrees in the subject. And so they do have to do a little bit of contortion to say, they love to use the phrase carbon intensity, for example. The carbon intensity has gone down, this many percent in the last 5 years. It's like, okay, well, what you're talking about with carbon intensity usually is just the amount of carbon it takes for you to create the product, or in the case of fossil fuel industries, to extract your fuel, right? What they're not covering is what's called scope 3 emissions, which scope 1 and scope 2 emissions cover, the emissions involved with the product and the materials as they're being I suppose, delivered to the site, but also constructed and extracted. Scope 3 is what happens when that thing, whether it's fuel, tons of coal, or F-35 jet, leaves the facility. And of course, that's where the bulk of the emissions is coming from, is when the US military is flying this thing around, popping balloons, and causing insane emissions and killing people by the climate crisis.
Bombing civilians,
Exactly, right. So to simply not count that is misleading at best. It's also just ridiculous, and it should be the easiest thing to call out.
So I'm kind of curious, have y'all been doing organizing and actions on some of these contractors specifically? Is there any particular company which you've singled out and tried to sort of move or bring about any sort of shift?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, CODEPINK has a long history with this. Most recently, like I said, this F-35 coalition has done amazing work, both at disrupting airfields, which are welcoming in these new jets, in Lockheed Martin itself. We recently had a disruption also at the Northrop Grumman major weapons manufacturer annual shareholder meeting. And we call them out every single year at their shareholder meetings for the same thing. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm gonna shift a little bit to the other corporate sector here, which is kind of timely and relevant. And so this week is the Blackrock shareholders meeting. I know that CODEPINK has had a long-standing campaign against Blackrock. I actually do a lot of climate bank campaigning myself over the years. And I'm kind of curious, maybe just tell us a little bit about how is BlackRock, which is a huge, private finance institution, what is their role in this?
Yeah, well, as you said, CODEPINK has a long-standing, we'll say, relationship with BlackRock on its funding of war crimes and weapons manufacturers. And actually, before I came to CODEPINK, I was, I've been and continue to be a local local-based climate organizer here in New York. And so my very first climate actions were at BlackRock. I mean, we are uniquely positioned in this city to target one of the planet's, arguably the planet's biggest funder of the climate crisis, and that's both through militarism and fossil fuels. I mean, this company continues to hold
and also things like agriculture too, like they're big funders of like Brazilian agriculture industry, for example.
Yeah, of course. I mean, their investment platform is morally bankrupt, and they use all kinds of language to take a passive voice around that, as though they don't manage it. But they could, if they were to take actual strides in sticking to their word and the word of their CEO Larry Fink, they could have real impact in partially decarbonizing the global economy to a great degree. I mean, this is a company that is second only to the US and China in terms of the financial power that it wields, right? This is a private company, and it's second only to the US and China.
Not public, and just for audience, it's not publicly traded. It's not publicly traded on the stock market. It's privately owned.
Right. But yeah, it's just stunning the amount of power that it wields. And so of course they have power over their own business operations. But if their CEO Larry Fink has a catchphrase, it's "We are a fiduciary to our clients," which is code for we don't call the shots. Like it's just our investors pulling the trigger. But of course they manage those platforms and those portfolios, and they've proven that they do so. In 2020, Fink wrote his annual letter to investors, and he said climate risk is investment risk. He was highlighting the fact that trillions of dollars are going to be lost in the coming years because of the climate crisis, and so that we need to adapt for financial reasons. Of course, he wasn't mentioning the mass death that's going to be a result of the climate crisis, but that seemed to be on track. People had a bit of hope that maybe we were going to be decarbonizing the financial industry a little bit, the financial sector. And he pulled a quick 180. I mean, both as a result of the war in Ukraine, profits during the pandemic, and now ESG's environmental environment, sustainability, and or social governance, environment, social and governance investing entering sort of the culture wars, and those being leveraged by Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, just to talk about that, bit, BlackRock is one of the companies that's singled out by the far right around being like woke Wall Street, right? Is that correct?
That is correct, and it's laughable for someone like me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's 2023 in many ways, politics is just like a big joke. Like 20 years ago, we never like imagined being where we're at right now as far as like the culture war stuff goes. And but the far right actually targets, some of these financial institutions because they actually don't like ESGs. I think they're trying to pass, at least in some state legislatures, they're trying to pass anti-ESG laws. They're definitely have been like, now that we have a House of Representatives that's barely controlled by the Republicans, they're having hearings on this. And
Right.
I'm just wondering what are your, as someone who campaigns against BlackRock, on climate and militarism, like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, and this actually ties into a question I also have, which is like, the right has actually been much more outspoken on some issues of war and empire of late, more than even an anti-war left. And so I'm just kind of curious how you feel like that all is connected.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about political interest and ultimately wealth. I mean, sure, the right has like a different take from the left on the war in Ukraine, but they want to go to war with China, and they're all invested in these contractors, right? I don't think people on the far right are so much less pugilistic just because of some of the things that they've said to oppose themselves across.
And none of the individuals would ever take a military base out of their district.
No, certainly not. Certainly not. So I mean, yeah, it's I personally I find embracing people on the far right simply for saying the most basic anti-war quote talking point to be a mistake for anti-war activists. The right has succeeded in bringing quote unquote woke investing, see, I'm even having to use their term, into the culture wars, and that pressure has paid off for them, unfortunately. I think that's a major reason why Larry Fink, for example, backed off on his pledges to reduce coal investments, for example, and why he has to come out very carefully whenever he is talking about ESG investments, because he's worried about losing business, he's worried about losing political sway, which, mind you, BlackRock has in spades. And so, yeah, it is a very unfortunate reality that we have to push up against. As a leftist climate organizer myself, this is absurd and frustrating. I go insane thinking about this because we are not. I've had people at a BlackRock action I was at recently. Someone on social media said, "Oh, all these activists were paid by Fink to make it appear as though he's responding to the left, or that he's." It's absolute BS. They continue to be the biggest funder of the climate crisis for so many reasons, and that's why we're out there all the time. And so, to paint them as being woke is ridiculous, and it would be funny if it were in like a TV script or a movie, but it's my life.
Yeah, mine too. I know that there's a lot of activism going on in New York, groups like New York Communities for Change and so on. I've been like targeting BlackRock quite a bit, and I'm curious how how much you're collaborating with them, how much you're coordinating with them.
Oh, all the time. I'll be at their annual shareholders meeting tomorrow morning with New York Communities for Change. And they're fantastic organizers. I love working with them. And what's really special about them, I think, is they are a grassroots member-based organization, and their members largely consist of low-income people of color in New York City who have seen the brunt of the climate crisis in New York City, have lost people to it. And so the way that they're able to really deftly connect what these financial institutions housed here in New York are doing to the climate, then come back and affect the most vulnerable New Yorkers, I think is right on the money. I mean, it's an environmental justice issue, and it's being wrought in Midtown.
Yeah, exactly. One other, why don't you actually, I have one other kind of like topic of conversation, but just for our folks in New York, and we'll repeat this again at the end, what can they do tomorrow? Because this will be out before Wednesday morning. But what can folks do if they hear this today and they want to go protest Blackrock tomorrow?
Yeah, so CODEPINK has an event page for this. I believe
we can put it in the show notes.
That'd be great. Yeah, so CODEPINK has an event page for this where you can sign right up to come join us. We have a meetup location nearby, and we're going to rally and protest during the shareholders meeting itself.
Is it virtual, or is it actually going to be in person?
So the shareholder meeting itself is virtual, but we know for sure that a bunch of these suits are going to be going into the building to do it via teleconference, and their employees, as always, will be walking in the building that morning. And so we are going to confront them. We have to be there every year at the shareholders meeting, because every year they are faced with a choice. They're faced with a choice to actually engage meaningfully with some of the promises that Fink once could make when he was being a little bit bolder or saying the right things, and to partially decarbonize the global economy, which is well within their wheelhouse. This year, there are 2 shareholder resolutions going to a vote, actually, that could engender such a change. The first one is basically for Blackrock to initiate a report on its ability to decarbonize the global economy. So to simply say, like, what are we able to do? Again, it's a low lift. They have people that are good with numbers. They can figure this out. The second one is actually one that the War is Not Green at CODEPINK wrote, and we call it the War Criminals Climate Report. And essentially what this does is it calls for an impact report on the climate effects of the biggest weapons and defense, quote, companies represented by Blackrock in an exchange traded fund called ITA. So that's very wordy, but basically Blackrock offers a platform for investment called ITA, and the top company represented in that is Raytheon. It's followed by Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, even Smith & Wesson is in there. All of these companies, General Dynamics, like you name them, it's the who's who of war crimes and civilian killings.
War profiteering.
War profiteering, yes, and massive amounts of emissions attributed to the Pentagon once those Scope 3 emissions, leave the factory. And again, we're just asking for them to report, to develop a report on what the impacts of these companies on the climate. Part of that greenwashing, if I can get back to that for a second, is if you look up the profile for this exchange traded fund called ITA, you'll see that there is a little grid that says sustainability characteristics, and they're doing their job. They're trying to show us how green they are and how much they care. In those sustainability characteristics, there are metrics provided by Morgan Stanley, which we'll forget about the irony of that for now. But Morgan Stanley says that they get an A rating for ESG. That means that this is a pretty environmental fund, and you shouldn't worry about investing in it. Just below that, 2 lines down, you can see the implied temperature rise associated with this fund. And that's a metric that tells you basically what span of degrees temperature rise, all things held constant, this ETF will produce. It says for that metric, the implied temperature rise for ITA is greater than 3 degrees Celsius. And for anyone that doesn't know, that is an apocalyptic level of warming. I mean, we have just, if you're watching the news, reading the news, we've just blown past 1.5, which was our goal from the Paris Agreement. And we are looking already at climate disasters that are killing.
Or they said we're going to blow past 1.5 in the next 5 years.
Right. But we've thank you for that clarification. But it's upcoming, right? It's all but a lost cause. But any amount that we can limit warming is an innumerable amount of lives saved. And the fact that this is going to contribute to greater than 3 degrees Celsius is unconscionable. I mean, this is that's labeling this as a doomsday weapon, essentially, this entire fund.
I mean, we talk about moving the doomsday clock. They move the doomsday clock closer and closer to midnight or whatever it is, based on the escalating tension between the U.S. and Russia around Ukraine because of a nuclear exchange or something like that. But this issue, the climate crisis, is like is just like easing us right into that end of the world scenario, or at least catastrophic, way of living. It's unbelievable, and that Biden signs off on fossil fuel projects, and Republicans don't even think this is real. They do everything they can to promote fossil fuels. It's nuts.
Right. And, I think in many ways, the danger that we're facing too is an issue of narrativizing it, right? Because when you talk about nuclear war, I mean, this is why anti-nuclear and peace activism, especially when, during the Cold War, was such a strong movement and forceful and affecting some real change, is because the impact of that, I think this is part of the reason, is the impact of that is really immediate. And you can imagine very, very clearly what happens to you, your family, your city, your country when a bomb is dropped. But the climate crisis, at least thus far, has appeared to most relatively privileged people on the planet as something that is rather abstract. I mean, every summer in New York, I tell people this is about to be the hottest summer in New York, and it's true. But we have a real issue with helping people to imagine the world that's being created, even before we help them to imagine the world as it ought to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we suffer from wildfires here every season, and even the supposed climate champion, of governor of California, also continues to sign off on fossil fuel permits in different parts of the state. We're kind of getting towards the end of time, and I have one other sort of area of question for you, which is, and I kind of want to talk about this from like both sides, which is, we have in many ways, we have this sort of vibrant street movement, and it has many intersections, and I actually feel like the sort of root of it is around capitalism and the political economy, but we talk about it with oppression and racial justice. We talk about it with climate, and there's a lot of consciousness around those issues, and a couple of other really important intersections. But there seems to be less of an intersection and less consciousness around issues of war and empire, more than there used to be. There used to be this really vibrant, strong anti-authoritarian left, anti-war movement, was connected in with oppression at home, racial justice issues, as well as environmental issues. And I'm just kind of wondering, why do you think there is right now a lack of consciousness around war and empire within a greater movement? And it could also just be my perspective, and feel free to disagree, but it is something that we note a lot on the show, is that there's a lack of consciousness around particularly empire issues, like what the US is doing overseas.
Yeah.
Big question too.
It is a big question. I mean, I'll speak from my perspective as a 25-year-old, which is, I think people have really come to accept militarization as a fact of life, and having seen, for a lot of people, at least the timeline, if you're my age, the timeline is like, okay, like 9/11 happened, we invaded Iraq, we pulled out of Iraq, now we're out of Afghanistan. And so it feels, because of those announcements, if you're really not paying attention, it feels as though we're trying to mitigate that engagement overseas, which is simply not true. And I think that's for people that are simply reading the headlines and not paying attention to the fact that, my God, we are an anomaly on the world stage. We are the imperialist anomaly, which seeks to extract profit, resources, and bodies from other countries. That is what the United States is. But every year, I mean, we've just approved an $858 billion Pentagon budget. We're shooting up towards $1 trillion the coming year. And I honestly think, and this is, I think, tied into sort of climate inaction as well, but like, I think for a lot of people to even begin to take action in this country, knowing fully what it's doing around the world and what it represents, I think I mean, I can tell you it's very draining. It can be very difficult to engage meaningfully and not cynically when faced with that fact. And so, I mean, and we also know for a fact as well that anti-war movements have been intentionally quelled and sabotaged by the government itself across the years. So certainly that's a factor. But in speaking to a general mood, I mean, I think it's really difficult for a human brain to contain all these catastrophes, all these crimes that our country is behind. And I certainly find myself having to compartmentalize a little bit when I'm working across that intersection. So yeah, I mean, it is really difficult. And, you know, I think to anyone doing this work, it requires a lot of strength that I'm kind of still learning to have. But I think something that's helpful is being really insistent and knowledgeable about what that intersection is, because the Venn diagram is, you know, it's almost like this. I mean, the reason for the climate crisis is the colonialism. The reason for the climate crisis is the extraction, the imperialism, the white supremacy. And that's part and parcel of what militarization from the US government is. So I think focusing on that intersection helps me to feel centered.
Yep. Excellent. Thank you for that. Why don't you, once more for the audience, 2 questions. Tell us if you're listening to this and people are in New York and they want to show up to join the Blackrock action tomorrow, where and when, or where at least to find it, and we can put it in the show notes too. And then 2, how to get just more involved in War is Not Green campaign with CODEPINK.
Yeah, for sure. So tomorrow morning is BlackRock's annual shareholder meeting, and climate activists and peace activists are going to turn out in force to say no to militarization, yes to decarbonization. CODEPINK and NYCC are among the groups represented. And you can meet us just outside of BlackRock's new headquarters in Hudson Yards. 50 Hudson Yards is the address. Make sure you go to the 10th Avenue side. You'll find us there a little bit after 9 a.m. And we'll join together to fly our employees as they go inside to protest the AGM as it happens and as they vote against our resolutions. And let's not let that be the end of our engagement, because we know this is not the end of our fight against BlackRock. I mean, this company has the power to save billions of lives, truly, and they won't do it, and that is criminal.
Yep, absolutely. Folks, you've been listening to Teddy Ogborn with CODEPINK, the coordinator of War is Not Green, the War is Not Green campaign, also an organizer based in New York City. And you've been listening to the Green and Red podcast. If you like what you hear, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on one of the many audio platforms, please rate and review us. It helps us with the algorithm. And then also, if you like what you hear, and check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/greenredpodcast, or just to make a one-time donation, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button. Teddy, thanks for your time, and thanks for actually all your work that you're doing here. This is like an important issue, which definitely needs to be, brought up over and over. And I'm glad we were able to bring you to Green and Red today to talk about it.
Yeah.
And
of course, Scott. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. This has been awesome, and yeah, I of course appreciate this opportunity to amplify all the work that we're doing. Because yeah, I mean, as we've talked about so much, you know, this fight unfortunately is in so many ways just beginning at this intersection of militarism and climate. So I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you about it.
Absolutely, and everyone else, talk to you again soon, and go out and make trouble and misbehave. Take care. Take care.
Yeah. Absolutely. Say it again, y'all. Yeah. What is absolutely. Listen to me.